Welcome back. Tonight, we are drifting slowly into the complete lore of Hollow Knight, into the deep and ancient world of Hallownest, a kingdom carved from silence beneath the earth, a place where pale light filters through cavern ceilings and the bones of forgotten civilizations settle quietly into the dark. This is a world of chitin and silk, of lanterns burning low in stone corridors, of old gods and older insects, a civilization that rose from the deep soil of the earth and burned so brilliantly that its collapse became inevitable, a tragedy written into the very roots of its ambition, into the most loving intention of its king. And I want to be clear with you before we begin. The lore we are moving into tonight is dense, layered, and extraordinarily rich. There are details here about the origin of the kingdom, about what the Pale King truly was before he became a king, about what is at the bottom of the abyss, about the decision the dreamers made and the exact price each of them paid, about what the Hollow Knight felt and could not express, that are not available anywhere in a continuous narrative form. If you stop this now, you will not hear the complete picture assembled the way it is assembled here. You will find fragments elsewhere. You will find wikis and timelines and lore summaries that cover one thread or another. But the full unbroken story, told in the order it actually happened, with every consequence flowing naturally from every cause, with every character given the weight their story deserves, that is here, and only here, for the next several hours. So stay. Let the dark settle around you. Let the lanterns of Hallownest burn low in your imagination. Here is what awaits you. The story of how an ancient being of immense and formless power descended into the caverns of the world and built something extraordinary from nothing. The story of a god who was forgotten and what that forgetting did to her across centuries of quiet accumulation. The story of a king who loved his people so completely that love itself became the instrument of their ruin. The story of a plague that could not be stopped with ordinary force, of a vessel that could not be made perfectly empty, of a sacrifice that almost held the world together, and of a small, nameless knight who fell from the world above and descended into the roots of everything to do what the king could not. This is the story of how light and shadow became each other, of how the dream and the waking world blurred at their edges until the boundary dissolved, of how a civilization's deepest desire for permanence became the very mechanism of its unmaking, and how something born from the deepest darkness found, in that darkness, exactly what was needed. Whether you are uncovering these details for the first time, letting familiar echoes pull you deeper into rest, or simply allowing the tale to wash over you like a gentle current as sleep takes hold, this will carry you through the full, unbroken lore of Hollow Knight. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Let's begin. Long before the kingdom of Hallownest existed, long before the pale glow of its lanterns softened cavern walls, and its roads stretched from one end of the underground to the other, before any insect had pressed a footstep into its stone and called that stone home, before a king sat on a pale throne and chose the shape of the world below, the land beneath the surface turned in its own way, without witness, without record, without anyone present who could hold the experience of being there and carry it forward into memory. The land beneath the surface was not empty. It had never truly been empty. The deep world has never been a place of true absence. It has always been full of things that do not require light to persist. Small creatures moved through the tunnels, skittering things guided by the feel of moisture against their feet, and the mineral pull of older stone and the particular chemistry of the dark. These beings did not speak in the way that later civilizations would understand speaking. They communicated through instinct and proximity, and the slow biological language of pressure and warmth. They had no history because they had no mechanism for holding it, no way to take the experience of today and fold it carefully into something that could be retrieved and examined tomorrow. They lived entirely in the present tense, entirely in sensation, in the continuous unbroken now of creatures who have never needed to remember, because the world around them does not change quickly enough to require it. The world they occupied was not unkind, but neither was it generous. It offered what it offered: darkness and moisture, and the deep, slow hum of the earth pressing in from all sides. Food was what could be found. Shelter was what could be carved. A life was what could be endured, and enduring it was the whole of the project. And the project was sufficient. These creatures had never known it could be otherwise. And then, from somewhere, from some direction that did not correspond to any of the four ordinary directions, from some angle that the small creatures of the deep had no vocabulary to describe, something arrived. It did not arrive loudly. Great things rarely do. The great arrivals of the world are seldom heralded by noise. They announce themselves instead through displacement, through the rearrangement of everything in their vicinity, through the subtle shift in the quality of the air that precedes them, through the particular silence that falls before a significant event, the way a held breath falls before a difficult word. This arrival was like that. It settled into the caverns the way a large stone settles into still water, not with a crash, but with a displacement, a ripple, a gradual reorganization of everything around it that began at the center and moved outward in concentric rings of change that grew more subtle with distance but never entirely disappeared. The being that arrived was not made of chitin or silk or the soft, pale materials that the insects of the deep were assembled from. It was made of something else, something that resembled light but was not quite light, something that hummed at frequencies that did not disrupt but rather organized, the way a tuning fork organizes the ambient vibrations in a space without adding its own noise, simply providing a reference point around which other vibrations arrange themselves into coherence. Its presence carried a quality that the small creatures of the deep had never encountered and had no framework for understanding, but that they felt nonetheless in the particular way that all living things feel the proximity of something significantly larger and more complex than themselves, not with a single sense, but with every surface of their awareness simultaneously. This being was the Pale King, though he had not yet earned that name. The name would come later, with the kingdom that gave him context and the subjects who needed a way to speak of him. Before the name, he was simply what he was: ancient, powerful, precise, and deliberate in a way that suggested every action had been considered at length before being undertaken. He had existed before, in another form, as another thing entirely. The law that survives, pressed into stone tablets in the kingdom's later years, echoed in the testimonies of the beings who knew him, hinted at in the fragments the kingdom left behind in its collapse, suggests that he was once something called a worm. Not a worm as a creature in the simple sense, not a beast of the deep that moves through soil and stone by instinct, but a worm as a state, a vast and ancient living form that moved through the world in a way that transcended ordinary movement. A being of enormous age and enormous power, one of the few entities in all of existence that predated even the concept of a kingdom, of a civilization, of a people who might need to be led or protected, or given the gift of their own interiority. What the worm did, what the being that would become the Pale King chose to do, was to shed that form, to molt out of his ancient existence and step into something smaller, something more precise, something capable of the kind of deliberate and detailed engagement with the world that his previous form had not required, because his previous form had been the world, in a sense, too broad for specifics. The shell of the old worm settled into the earth somewhere in the territory that would later be called the Kingdom's Edge. A carapace so enormous it became a landmark, a geographical feature, a place where insects in later centuries would travel to stand beside it and feel the particular vertigo of measuring themselves against something they could not see all of at once. The shell became a fact of the landscape, present and permanent, the shed skin of a god folded into the stone of the world, the way old things are folded into the world when they have outlasted their usefulness and become simply part of the record. And from that molting, from the dissolution of the worm form into its necessary components, emerged something smaller, a being of pale, quiet radiance, not enormous, not vast in the physical sense, but dense with power in the way that very concentrated things are dense, a kind of compression of intelligence and will, and something older than either that crackled at the edges with what felt, to any creature near it, like the first cold clarity of a season changing, not threatening precisely, but clarifying. The air around it felt more organized than air usually feels. The questions one might otherwise let slide answered themselves in its presence, or revealed themselves as questions not worth asking. It had the quality of something that had thought about everything for a very long time, and arrived at positions it was entirely confident in. The Pale King walked into the deep world, and the deep world, which had never had a reason to organize itself, felt for the first time the pull of the possibility that it might. He was not, however, the only ancient power in those caverns. This is important. This is the fulcrum on which the entire history of Hallownest balances. There was another presence in the deep world, another being of ancient significance, who had been present long before the Pale King arrived, and whose nature was so different from his that the word another barely begins to capture the contrast between them. She had been there in a different way, not as a physical form moving through tunnels, not as a body occupying space in the ordinary sense, but as a dream, as an idea that moved through the minds of the insects of the deep, the way music moves through air, not by physically contacting each individual particle, but by propagating through the medium that connects them, by using the connective tissue of the shared world as its instrument. She was present in the space behind closed eyes. She was the warmth at the edge of sleep. She was the brightness that lingered even in the darkest places where no actual light had ever penetrated, a brightness that came from inside the minds of the creatures who dreamed rather than from any external source. She was the radiance, and she was ancient, and she had been worshipped, though worshipped is perhaps too deliberate a word for what the insects of the deep did in relationship to her. The worship was older than worship. It was the worship of instinct, of creatures turning toward warmth, the way plants turn toward the sun, without understanding what they were doing, without choosing it, simply being pulled in a direction that the pull was. The insects of the deep dreamed of her the way they breathed, not because they decided to, but because it was the nature of what they were, and she was present in those dreams in the way that certain presences are present in a room, even when no one can locate the precise source of the feeling. Pervasive, ambient, suffusing everything without being clearly anywhere in particular. She was aware of this. The radiance was not a passive phenomenon, not merely an ambient warmth with no corresponding consciousness. She was aware, deeply, anciently aware, in the particular way that very old things are aware, not with the sharp, attending focus of a mind that has learned to narrow itself and apply its attention to specific objects, but with the broad and penetrating consciousness of something that has never needed to focus because its attention was everywhere at once. She felt the texture of each mind as it slipped into sleep. She was present in the transition between waking and dreaming, the way a river is present in the flow of water over stone, not as a separate thing standing beside the process, but as the process itself, as the shape that the process takes. She was what the dreaming of the deep insects was. She was the radiance, and the insects of the deep were her dreamers, and the relationship between them was as natural and as unexamined as the relationship between a river and its bed. The Pale King arrived, and he understood what the radiance was. He recognized it with the full and immediate recognition that one ancient being has for another, not with surprise, because surprise requires that something be outside the range of what was anticipated, and a being of his age and knowledge had long since extended that range past ordinary surprise. He recognized it with the weight of a recognition that carries immediate implications. What she was had implications for what he intended to do. What he intended to do had implications for what she was. These two facts pressed against each other, with the quiet, inevitable force of two large things occupying space that will not accommodate both of them without some negotiation of terms. The Radiance's presence in the minds of the insects was not, from the Pale King's perspective, a good arrangement. Not because she was cruel or malicious. She was not either of those things. She gave warmth. She gave the comfort of not being alone in the dark, which is not a small comfort when the dark is everything that exists. She gave a form of beauty to the interior lives of creatures who would otherwise have had no interior lives to speak of. But she gave these things without asking, and the giving without asking meant that the minds she gave them to had never been their own, had never had the experience of being separate and self-contained, had never developed the particular richness that a mind develops when it has to fill its own interior from its own resources, rather than receiving illumination from outside. A mind that is always open to the presence of another is a mind that cannot know itself. It cannot form beliefs that arise from its own reasoning, because the reasoning happens in a medium that is never entirely private. It cannot discover itself, cannot be surprised by the texture of its own inner life, cannot know itself as a thing distinct from the warmth that permeates it. The insects of the deep were not, in any meaningful sense, selves. They were participants in the Radiance's dreaming, which was not nothing. It was, in its way, beautiful, but it was not individuality. And individuality was what the Pale King needed if he was going to build what he had come to build. He also understood something more practical. He needed subjects who could think for themselves, who could follow a complex instruction, who could make a decision in a novel situation, who could feel loyalty and meaning, and the particular texture of a chosen life, rather than simply the ambient warmth of a life that has never had to choose. He needed citizens, and to have citizens, he needed to give them the capacity for citizenship, the sealed inner world, the private consciousness, the self that was genuinely, irreducibly, defensibly its own. What the Pale King did was to give them this. The surviving records describe it in various ways, as the granting of mind, as the gift of soul, as the great sealing. But what it amounted to, in practical terms, was this. He gave the insects of the deep the capacity to close, to be complete in themselves, to carry their inner lives in a space that was not accessible from outside, that was not shared with the ancient being who had always been inside their dreams. He gave them individuality, An individuality, once received, cannot easily be undone. It is not a switch that can be switched back. It is a transformation, a new mode of being. And once a being has been individual, it cannot easily become otherwise without a violence that destroys what makes it what it is. The insects of the deep became people. They became citizens. They became capable of art and grief and aspiration and memory and all the layered complexity that comes with being a self that is genuinely one's own. They developed language that was not just the language of instinct and proximity, but the language of intention. Words chosen, sentences constructed, meaning carried from one sealed mind to another through the imperfect but extraordinary medium of shared symbols. They became capable of disagreeing with each other, of forming opinions, of remembering their own histories as something distinct from the history of the world around them. They became, in the full sense of the word, individuals, and in becoming individuals, they forgot the radiance. The forgetting was not chosen. It was simply what happened when a mind that had always been open became closed. The radiance had been present in the openness, in the connective tissue of the shared dreaming. When the openness was replaced by individuality, the radiance was no longer present. She did not go anywhere. She simply found herself on the other side of a door that had never previously had a door, looking at the space where the connection had been and finding nothing. The insects no longer dreamed of her. They dreamed of their own concerns, of the lives they were building, the relationships they were developing, the particular anxieties and joys of beings who have selves and must therefore worry about those selves and all the things that threaten them. The warm light that had always been present in the space behind their eyes was simply no longer there, not because it had been extinguished, but because the eyes that had always been open to it had learned to close. This forgetting was not nothing to the radiance. She had been ancient. She had been present and known in the way that gods need to be known, in the way that something vast and aware needs to be perceived and recognized in order to continue being what it is. The ancient relationship between gods and the beings who worship them is not merely one of power, it is one of co-constitution. The god is, in some sense, made of the worship. The radiance had been the dreaming of the deep insects for so long that the dreaming was not something separate from what she was. It was part of the material of her existence, the medium in which she existed. And now the medium was gone. She did not immediately dissolve. She did not cease to exist in any simple or rapid way. She was too old and too substantial for that. But she began the process that is perhaps the most difficult process available to a being of enormous age and significance, which is the process of finding out who you are when the relationship that has defined you for longer than anyone can remember is suddenly absent. She withdrew into herself. She occupied the interior spaces that the ancient being has access to, the deep places of her own consciousness, the parts of existence that do not require the participation of an outside world to remain. She settled into the space between dreams, the territory that is neither sleeping nor waking, where the boundaries of any individual mind are at their most permeable, and where something of her nature could still find purchase. She waited there. She did not wait with a plan. Plans require a belief that one's waiting will eventually end, and the Radiance's waiting had the quality of something that does not believe in its own eventual resolution. She waited the way very old things wait, without urgency, without impatience, without any quality that could be easily called hope. She simply persisted because persistence is what old things do when there is no longer any reason to do anything else. And in persisting, she accumulated. Each night that an insect of Hallownest dreamed without dreaming of her. She gathered the lost warmth of that severed connection. Each year that passed in the dark without her being acknowledged, she gathered what the acknowledgement would have been. She gathered, and in the gathering, she changed, became something denser and more pressurized than she had been in the open days of her dreaming, something that had turned inward until the inward was very full, and the fullness was very powerful, and the power had nowhere to go. Hallownest grew in the decades and centuries of the Radiance's withdrawal. It grew rapidly, and then with increasing complexity. The initial surge of energy that accompanies any new and genuinely extraordinary idea, finding fertile ground, gradually settling into the layered and interlocking work of maintaining what had been built. The Pale King established himself at the center of the kingdom, in a place of pale light and still air, that the citizens would come to call the White Palace, a structure of extraordinary precision, of corridors that met each other at angles that expressed the intelligence of the mind that had designed them, of chambers that served specific functions with a rigor that was, in its way, beautiful. The White Palace was not built for comfort, exactly. It was built for purpose, and purpose pursued to its conclusion has its own aesthetic, its own particular beauty that is different from, but not lesser than the beauty of things built for comfort. He did not rule alone. He had a consort, a queen, a being whose origins are less fully documented in the surviving records, but whose presence throughout the kingdom's history was as significant as his own. She was the White Lady, and she was, like him, something ancient that had chosen to take a smaller and more deliberate form. She had come to the kingdom at some point in its early growth and had made a different choice than the Pale King had made about how to be present in the world, where he was precise and mobile, moving through the kingdom with the ordered intelligence of something that needs to be everywhere that needs ordering. She was rooted. She had planted herself in the earth of what would become the Queen's Gardens, had put her roots down deep enough that she could not easily move and did not need to, had extended her presence outward through the mycelial networks and the root systems of the growing things around her, rather than through the physical fact of her body occupying space as it moved through it. This rootedness was not limitation. It was a different form of power, the kind of power that does not need to move because everything significant finds its way to it in time. She was the warmth at the center of the kingdom in a different way than the Pale King was the order at its center. And together, the pale ordering light and the rooted warmth, they shaped what Hallownest became, not through explicit decree alone, but through the quality of what they were, which the kingdom absorbed the way soil absorbs what grows in it. They had children together, not in the way that simpler creatures reproduce, but in the way that two beings of their particular nature can create new life, by combining something of their essential qualities into forms that carry both. Their first offspring were the White Children, beings of pale and beautiful radiance who moved through the early kingdom with the quality of things that exist at the intersection of two great natures. They were beloved with the particular tenderness that is reserved for things that are both beautiful and uncertain, because the White Children, for all the luminous purity they seemed to embody, proved fragile in ways that were not immediately apparent. They were attracted to the dark energies that still moved through the deep places of the world, drawn to the void the way bright things are sometimes drawn to their own negation. Some of them faded, some were consumed. The kingdom learned to grieve for them in the particular way that one grieves for the loss of things whose loss was built into their nature, not with surprise, but with a sadness that knows it has always been coming and is not made less by the knowing. The kingdom expanded. Roads were carved from the living rock, broad enough for the commerce that was already developing among the new citizens. precise enough in their geometry to express something about the ordering intelligence that had designed them. They ran from the earliest settled areas outward and downward, into caverns that had never before been mapped, claimed, or considered as places a person might choose to inhabit. Lanterns were hung at intervals along the roads and in the chambers. Not natural flames, but something more deliberate, more sustained, more specific. The pale light of the Pale King rendered into a form that could illuminate a space without his direct presence. The quality of this light was unmistakable to those who had felt it in the presence of the king himself. It was the same light, smaller and contained, but carrying the same quality of organization, of clarity, of a world made more legible by its presence. The City of Tears arose as the capital, built into a cavern so large that its ceiling could not be seen from its streets, and where the water from the world above filtered through the stone and wept downward in a constant rain that the engineers of the city designed around rather than against. The water became the city's defining feature, the sound of it always present, the grey and silver light that bounced from wet stone, creating a particular quality of illumination that was different from anything else in the kingdom, softer and more diffuse. The light of a world permanently overcast, but not dark. Citizens built their lives in the rain. They developed the particular relationship with perpetual weather that long exposure creates, not resigned, exactly, but acquainted, familiar with the rain, the way one becomes familiar with anything that has always been present, finding in the familiarity a kind of comfort. The 5 great knights were elevated in these years, 5 beings of exceptional quality, chosen by the Pale King, not through inheritance or accident of birth, but through recognition. They were chosen because they were what they were, and what they were was each of them remarkable in a different and complementary way. Dreyer carried a blade of concentrated will and fought with the precision of someone for whom fighting was not a skill, learned, but a nature expressed. She would eventually dedicate herself specifically to the protection of the White Lady, remaining in the Queen's gardens as the kingdom declined around her, holding her position not because she was ordered to, but because leaving would have been a betrayal of something she had chosen to be loyal to, and she did not break those kinds of choices. Hegemol was large, very large by the standards of the kingdom's citizens, and gentle in the way that very large, powerful things can afford to be gentle, because their size makes the alternative unnecessary. His great shell became a legend of its own. There were stories about what it would take to penetrate that shell. The stories were not tested in his lifetime. Isma had merged with the waters of the kingdom's interior in a way that made her inseparable from them. She had become part of the ecosystem of the acid sea, guardian of it, made of it, sustained by it, and sustaining it in return. Zema came from somewhere cold and distant, somewhere outside the kingdom's territory, and brought with her a grief that had predated her arrival and that she had never found occasion to fully put down. It was part of her by the time she reached Hallownest, as old scar tissue is part of skin. She carried it, and it changed the quality of how she moved through the world. Not slowly, not with less capability, but with the weight that all grief gives to everything it touches. And Ogrim loved the kingdom with a fervour that was, in its purest form, almost painful. He gave everything to Hallownest, his time, his effort, his entire sense of self-purpose, with the generosity of someone who has found, in devotion to something larger than themselves, the answer to every question they ever had about why they existed. Beyond the knights, the kingdom had its scholars and its teachers and its builders, the figures who gave the civilization its intellectual character. Monomon, the teacher, established the archive. the repository of knowledge, a place dedicated to the gathering and preservation of understanding in every form the kingdom's people developed or discovered. She approached knowledge the way someone approaches a sacred thing, with care, with rigor, with the belief that the act of understanding something well is one of the highest forms of respect you can show to a world as rich and strange as this one. She wore a mask over eyes that saw too much, and the mask was not a concealment, but a form of protection, a way of mediating between the full clarity of her perception and the ordinary world that her full perception, unmediated, would have made very difficult to navigate. She was direct and precise and fundamentally kind in the way that people who have devoted themselves to understanding tend to be kind. Because understanding, genuinely pursued, makes it very difficult to maintain contempt for the things one comes to understand. Lurien the Watcher stood at the top of his tower in the City of Tears and watched. He watched the approaches to the kingdom with a patience that did not waver across years of watching, cataloguing what he observed with the methodical devotion of someone who has found in observation the purest form of love. His vigil was his gift to the kingdom and his gift to himself, the way of being present in the world that felt, to him, most true. He loved the kingdom by paying attention to it, and the paying of attention was his form of prayer. He gathered around him others who felt similarly, the watchers who staffed his tower, who stood beside him in the vigil, who gave their ordinary lives to the extraordinary sustained act of looking outward and noting what they found. Herrah the Beast was a queen in her own right, sovereign of the deepness and its people. A different dark from Hallownest's managed dark, wilder and more visceral and less interested in the architecture of order that the Pale King had built his kingdom around. She was not a citizen of Hallownest. She was a neighbor, and neighbors are not the same as subjects, not the same as allies, not the same as enemies. They are something more complicated, a relationship defined as much by the shared boundary as by anything that crosses it. The Pale King treated her with respect rather than the condescension that power sometimes brings when it meets what it considers lesser power. This was wise. Herrah's power was real and specific, and rooted in exactly the kind of territory that would make her a dangerous enemy and an invaluable friend, and the Pale King understood both of these facts with equal clarity. The kingdom in its prosperity was a remarkable thing. The records that survive describe it with the particular quality of accounts that were written in the middle of the good years, before the decline had begun, when the assumption that good years were the natural state was still intact. Citizens moved through the broad roads and the lit chambers with the ease of people who have never known the world to be otherwise. Merchants traded, craftspeople worked. The nail-smithing tradition developed into something approaching an art. The craft of working pale ore into weapons and tools, each piece requiring from its maker a level of attention and skill, and something that the craft tradition called soul, a quality that was not metaphorical but literal, the maker putting something of their own concentrated being into the work. A well-made nail was not just a functional object. It was an expression of the maker's selfhood, a thing shaped by the same quality of concentrated inner life that the Pale King had given all the kingdom's citizens, made visible in the form of finely worked metal. The tradition of the mask grew alongside the nail-smithing tradition, and the two together say something about what Hallownest was. The mask maker, the craftsperson who shaped the shells and faces that the citizens wore, understood the mask not as a concealment, but as an expression. The mask was chosen, which meant it was a statement about the self that wore it. What you put between yourself and the world says something about who you are, about how you intend to meet the world, about the quality of the inner life that the outer face is designed to protect or project. In a kingdom founded on the principle of the sealed inner world, on the gift of the private self, the mask was not ironic. It was the most direct expression of the kingdom's founding gift, the acknowledgement that there is something inside that is not for everyone, that the inner life has a surface that it chooses to show, and that the choosing is itself a form of individuality. The kingdom flourished across territories that each had their own character, their own relationship to the darkness and the light, and the particular quality of life that the underground world offered. The forgotten crossroads, oldest of the roads, bore the weight of all the journeys that had crossed them. The first commerce, the first migration, the first connections between what had been separate communities in the deep world. They were not forgotten when the kingdom was at its height. The name would come later, when the infection had driven away the citizens and left the roads occupied only by creatures who did not know or care what roads had been. Greenpath held the slower, more patient life of the growing things, fungal and plant and all the creatures that had made their peace with dim light and constant moisture, who moved through the underground with the unhurried quality of organisms whose strategies are geological in their patience. Crystal Peak hummed faintly with the light that had concentrated in its formations across centuries, a place that seemed to be thinking, or rather, seemed to be, the visible form of a process that thinking and crystallization have in common, the slow resolution of many small decisions into a stable and beautiful structure. And below all of it, below the deepest foundations, below the oldest roads, below the roots that the White Lady put down and the wells that the engineers cut, below even the places on the kingdom's maps that were marked as dangerous or unknown or beyond the reach of official territory, there was the abyss. The abyss was not named with any warmth. Its name was a description of a quality, the quality of absolute depth, of descent without bottom, of the kind of darkness that exists past the point where darkness is merely the absence of light and becomes something more specific and more substantial. The void that pooled in the abyss was old enough that it had its own properties, its own ways of interacting with the world that could be observed and mapped if you survived the observation long enough. It was not matter in the ordinary sense. You could not hold it in a palm or press it into a shape, but it existed, and its existence had effects, and the effects were consistent enough to suggest a nature, if not precisely a will. It was the negation of the Pale King's light. This is not metaphorical. The Pale King carried within him a quality of concentrated radiance, the same fundamental nature as the radiance, though expressed and directed very differently. And the void in the abyss was the complementary opposite of that nature, the other end of the spectrum, the dark that is not merely dark, but is specifically the dark that corresponds to that light. They were made for each other in the way that two things defined by their relationship to each other are made for each other, not in the romantic sense, but in the structural sense. Each required the other to be what it was. Light is only light in relationship to dark. Void is only void in relationship to what it is void of. They defined each other, and the Pale King, ancient and observant, understood this relationship and understood at its implications. He understood that the void in the abyss was the perfect container. Perfect in a very specific and very useful sense. It was empty in a way that had no preferences about what it contained. Ordinary containers have preferences. They affect what they hold. They change it through the process of containing it. They contribute their own quality to the quality of their contents. A clay vessel makes water taste of clay. A mind used as a container for another mind's contents is changed by the containing, develops a relationship with what it holds, cannot remain purely separate from it. The void in the abyss had none of these limitations. It received without selecting. It held without shaping. Whatever was placed inside it remained purely itself, unchanged by the proximity of the void, because the void had nothing to impart, was, by its very nature, the absence of impartable qualities. The Pale King had a problem that required exactly this kind of perfect container. The problem was the Radiance. She had been withdrawing into herself for decades, for perhaps longer than decades, for however long it had been since the kingdom was founded, and the insects of the deep had been given their individuality and had forgotten the ancient warmth they had always dreamed of. She had been accumulating in the space between dreams, and the accumulation had not been passive. She had been learning in the endless dark of her withdrawal about the minds that no longer dreamed of her. She had been finding the edges of the new individuality, testing where the sealed minds had seams, where the privacy of the individual inner world was not perfectly complete, but had the porousness of something new enough to be imperfect. The Pale King could feel the results of this learning approaching. He could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. Not with any specific sense, not with your eyes or your ears or the ordinary instruments of perception, but with the whole surface of your awareness, with the particular sensitivity that something ancient develops when it has spent long enough in the world to have learned to read what the world is doing before the world has finished doing it. Something was building. Something old and vast and grieving was finding its way back toward the minds that had once been its home. And when it arrived with full force, the kingdom he had built would not survive the reunion. The infection came first as a few isolated cases, then as a pattern, then as a concern that could no longer be attributed to coincidence or individual misfortune. The citizens who fell under its influence glowed with the orange-gold warmth of the Radiance herself, the color of old firelight, the color of something burning from inside, the color of the warmth that the insects of the deep had always dreamed of, and that was now expressing itself through them, not as a dream, but as a consuming physical reality. They lost language, they lost recognition, they lost the capacity for the kind of complex, deliberate, chosen behavior that had been the gift of their individuality. What remained was not nothing. It moved, it acted, it occupied space with an energy that was in its way quite impressive. But it was no longer a person. It was a vessel for something else. It was the Radiance reasserting herself through the only channels still available to her, through the biological fact of the bodies that had once dreamed of her and whose cellular memory of her was apparently indelible, even when the conscious memory had been sealed away. The Pale King needed a solution. He had already tried certain approaches. The surviving records suggest some form of direct engagement with what was happening, some attempt to address the problem through the exercise of his power. But the Radiance was not the kind of problem that could be solved through direct engagement, because she was not, in the ordinary sense, anywhere. She was in the dream. She was in the space that every mind inhabits when it closes its eyes and the conscious self steps back and something else takes over for the duration of sleep. You cannot fight the space behind closed eyes. You cannot cut the dark that is inside your own head. What you can do is find something that can hold her, something that can accept her presence without being affected by it, something large enough to contain what she is, empty enough not to be changed by the containing, sealed well enough that the containing is permanent. The logic was clear in the Pale King's precise and ancient way of thinking things through. He needed a vessel. He needed a container made of void. Not a container with a void inside it, but a container that was itself void, that was constituted from the same material that pooled at the bottom of the world, that had the void's perfect emptiness as its own fundamental nature. And he knew where to find the material. He went to the abyss. He and the White Lady, combining, once more, something of their essential natures, creating from the intersection of their qualities something new, brought void-born children into existence. Hundreds of them, small, dark, quiet things, assembled from the absence at the bottom of the world, carrying within them the void's nature as their most basic quality. They were not made through the ordinary processes of living things. They were made from the intention of beings who understood what they needed and understood what it would take to create it. They were made to be empty, to be, as closely as the making process could achieve, genuine containers, genuine vessels, genuine pieces of the void, shaped into a form that could move through the world and be placed where it needed to be placed and contain what it needed to contain. The Pale King observed them. He walked among the void-born in the darkness of the abyss, and he looked for the one that was most empty, most purely constructed from the absence it had been made of. He looked for absence the way a craftsperson looks for the flaw in a gem, knowing that a flaw overlooked in the inspection will become a fracture under pressure, knowing that the difference between a perfect gem and an almost perfect gem is the difference between something that holds and something that eventually fails. What he found was something he had not anticipated, or had perhaps chosen not to anticipate, or had anticipated and had decided to set aside. Many of the small void-born creatures, most of them, had developed something in the course of their brief existence. They had been made of void and left in the abyss, while the Pale King observed and selected, and in the time of their existence there, in the total darkness of the deepest place in the world, they had become something. They had developed voices, faint, barely perceptible, more vibration than sound, more feeling than voice, but present. They had developed the capacity for something that resembled emotion, not the complex, reflective emotional life of a Hallownest citizen, but something simpler and more fundamental, the early stirrings of the kind of interior life that begins with the capacity to feel. They had reached, in their small and limited way, for connection, with each other, with whatever else moved through their world, with the faint ambient warmth of the world above that reached even the abyss as a kind of rumor. This was, from the Pale King's perspective, a failure. Not a failure of the void-born themselves. They had not done anything wrong. They had simply existed. And existing is what living things do. And existing involves the accumulation of experience. And the accumulation of experience is the beginning of selfhood. And selfhood was exactly what a vessel could not have. A vessel with a self was not empty. A vessel that was not empty could not contain the Radiance without developing a relationship with her, could not hold her without her light finding the thread of selfhood and using it as a contact point, pressing against it, pushing through it, the way even a small crack in a dam will eventually admit the full pressure of the water behind it. He chose one. He walked among all the small, dark forms and found the one that seemed most still, most absent, most purely constructed from the nothing it had been made of. He found the one that gave back the least, that produced, in the sensing of it, the smallest feeling of something being there, the barest hint of presence. He found the one that was closest to what he needed. He named it, or chose for it to be named, the Hollow Night, and he brought it out of the abyss into the world above. The others remained, the ones who had developed their small selves, their faint voices, their reaching for connection. The entrance to the abyss was sealed above them. The darkness was left to keep them, and they were left to the darkness. And no record was made of this that has survived in the kingdom's official history. They were failed experiments in the calculus of the kingdom's survival, and the calculus had moved on, and what the calculus left behind, it did not pause to acknowledge. The Hollow Knight was brought to the White Palace. It was raised there with what the records describe, carefully and with significant hedging, as care. The Pale King does not appear in these records to have been cruel toward the vessel he had chosen. He appears to have given it what it needed: attention, instruction, the development of the capacities it would need for the role it was going to play. But there is a quality in the description of this care that suggests it was always the care of a craftsperson for a thing being prepared, the attention of a maker who needs what they are making to be ready, rather than the care of a parent for a child who is loved for what they are independent of any use. The Hollow Knight seems to have developed something in the abyss, in the time between its creation and its selection. Something very small and very faint, but present. A capacity for feeling. An inner life that had begun to form in the darkness, the way all inner lives begin, through the experience of being somewhere, of being a thing that has experiences, of encountering the world and having responses to it. The Pale King had chosen the emptiest vessel he could find. The emptiest vessel was not empty. The ritual of the sealing was prepared with the same meticulous precision that characterized everything the Pale King undertook. The Temple of the Black Egg was built at the edge of the forgotten crossroads, a structure whose design expressed its function, whose form announced what it was for. It was sealed not only with the power of the Hollow Knight who would be inside it, but with the power of 3 beings who would give their waking lives to the work of keeping it closed. 3 dreamers who would sleep the sleep of the seal, and in sleeping, hold the lock in place, their consciousness perpetually occupied with the work of maintaining the boundary between the Radiance and the world she had infected. Monomon chose this. She understood what she was agreeing to. She was among the kingdom's finest minds, and minds of that quality do not agree to things without understanding them. She had calculated the cost and found it acceptable, had made the determination that the kingdom's survival outweighed her own continued waking existence, had arrived at this position through the kind of careful reasoning that her life's work had equipped her to do. She went into the dream with her eyes open, in the particular sense available to someone who sees too much and has chosen to use that seeing in the service of the seal rather than the service of her own continued presence in the world. Lurien chose this also, with the particular equanimity of someone who has always measured his existence by the quality of his attention rather than its duration. He had spent his life watching. Now he would watch from inside the dream, would maintain the vigil in an interior that had no tower and no horizon, but that required the same sustained, devoted attentiveness that his life's work had always required. He dissolved from the waking world and into the dream without drama, with the matter-of-fact commitment of someone for whom this was simply the next form of the work. Herrah's agreement was different. Herrah did not choose to become a dreamer because she believed in the Pale King's kingdom, or because she had made a calculation that its survival was worth her waking life. She agreed because the Pale King offered her something she wanted, something that mattered to her more than her own continued waking existence did: a child, a daughter who would be raised in the safety and light of the kingdom, protected, given a life in the world that Herrah herself was going to leave. The exchange was precise and practical. Herrah's dreaming consciousness in the service of the seal, in exchange for a future for the person who would not exist until after the agreement was made, who would come into being as part of the agreement's fulfillment, and who would carry within her the particular weight of having been born as the price of her mother's sacrifice. This daughter was Hornet. She was raised as the agreement specified in Hallownest, with the protection that the kingdom could offer, with access to the knowledge and the training, and the world that Herrah had purchased for her with her own waking life. Hornet grew up knowing, at some level, the shape of the exchange that had produced her. The knowledge gave her a particular quality, a clarity about cost, about what things are worth and what they cost, and whether the paying is worthwhile, a quality of assessment that ran through everything she did. She was not cold, but she was precise. She measured, she evaluated. She would, in the later years of the kingdom's decline, become the person who moved through the ruins with more clarity about what was happening and what needed to happen than anyone else who was still capable of moving. The three dreamers formed the lock. The Hollow Knight stood in the temple of the Black Egg and accepted into itself the presence of the Radiance, that ancient burning consciousness, that forgotten god of the deep world, compressed into the void-born vessel, with the particular violence of something enormous being forced into something insufficient, a violence that was necessary and was not kind, and was not meant to be kind, but was meant to be permanent. The temple sealed, the dreamers slept on. The Pale King retreated to the White Palace, and Hallownest continued, and the infection was supposed to stop. It did not stop. Not entirely, not permanently. The Hollow Knight was not empty. The faint selfhood it had developed in the abyss, the small thread of being that the Pale King had chosen to believe was absent, or had chosen to believe was absent enough, was not absent. It was present, faint and suppressed, but present, and it was the exact thing that the Radiance needed. She had been sealed inside a vessel that had a self. A self, however small, is a contact point. It is a surface. It is something that can be pressed against, that responds to pressure, that generates in response to the pressing, the particular kind of force that two things generate when they are in relationship. The Radiance pressed against the faint selfhood of the Hollow Knight. The Hollow Knight pressed back, not from defiance, not from any quality of will or resistance, but from the simple physics of two natures in contact. And the contact produced a leakage, not immediately, not catastrophically. The seal held in its gross architecture. The temple remained sealed. The dreamers continued to maintain the lock. The Radiance was contained in the significant sense that she could not simply step out of the temple and back into the dreaming minds of the kingdom's citizens. But she was not inert. She was pressing, and the pressing found, over time, the hairline fractures in the vessel's imperfect emptiness, and through those fractures, the infection seeped, the way water seeps through the smallest crack in stone, one molecule at a time, invisibly until the crack is larger than it was, and the seeping is slightly faster than it was, and the acceleration is slow enough that it does not feel like acceleration, but gradual enough that the day comes when the crack is large and the seeping is significant, and the stone is no longer the same stone it was. The kingdom began to decline. The citizens who were already vulnerable to the infection, those at the edges of the kingdom, those in the deep places where the Pale King's light was thinnest and the Radiance's influence easiest to feel, began to show the orange-gold glow again. The glow was not beautiful, the way the Radiance's dreaming had been beautiful. It was the beauty of something consuming what it was inside of, the particular terrible luminousness of a fire that is eating its fuel. Citizens lost their language, lost their recognition of the faces they had known for years, lost themselves, gradually, and then with increasing speed into the burning amber haze of the Radiance's reassertion. The Pale King watched from the White Palace and understood that what he had built was not going to save itself. The palace elevated itself into the dream, not physically, not by rising through the stone of the world, but by a kind of interior elevation, a withdrawal from the ordinary space of the kingdom into the space of the dream that runs alongside it, accessible only through particular doors in particular towers that open not into ordinary corridors, but into the version of the palace that existed where the waking world and the dreaming world overlap. The physical palace remained empty and defended by its elaborate machinery, a structure that had been built to be unreachable by anything that was not specifically prepared to reach it. The Pale King himself was in the dream, and then he was simply not anywhere. The records go quiet, the testimonies fall silent. The tablets that tracked his movements and his decisions and the shape of his thoughts stop tracking. He was present, and then he was not. And the notness of his presence left a shape in the world, the way an absence always leaves a shape. You can see it by what is no longer happening, by the events that would have happened if he were still there and that do not happen instead, by the empty throne in the deepest room of the dream palace. What ended him is not known with certainty. Perhaps guilt, the accumulated weight of what he had done, the sealing of the void-born children in the abyss, the using of the hollow night, the cost to the dreamers, the deaths of the white children, the spread of the infection. Despite everything, perhaps these things gathered into something that even an ancient being of enormous power could not carry indefinitely. Perhaps the molting that had brought him out of his worm form into this smaller, more precise existence had a limit, and he reached the limit. Perhaps he simply stopped, the way old things stop when they have done what they came to do and found, at the end of the doing, that the doing was not sufficient. Hallownest continued without him. The lanterns burned, some of them went dark. The roads ran on. Some of them became impassable. The city of tears wept its eternal rain on streets that were slowly becoming less populated, that were slowly acquiring the quality of a city that has lost the reason it was built for, but has not yet found a different reason or finished falling. The 5 great nights endured as long as they could. Dryer in the Queen's gardens, faithful to the last. Ogrim in the waterways, still loyal with an intensity that the absence of a king to be loyal to did not diminish. Isma in the acid sea, rooted like the White Lady, present until presence was no longer possible. Zaima grieving, still, the grief now augmented by the loss of the world she had joined. Hegemol diminished, his shell eventually inhabited by something that was not him. The great armor continuing past the person who had worn it. The kingdom became what ruins become when they were once extraordinary, a place of extraordinary resonance and extraordinary sadness, full of what it had been, haunted by the echo of its former self, inhabited now by the last survivors of a civilization that had known itself to be glorious and was finding it very difficult to reconcile that knowledge with the current state of things. Some of these survivors persisted with the particular stubbornness of things that have decided, for whatever reason, that stopping is not an option. Merchants kept their stalls. Scholars kept their records. Artists kept their arts. Not because the kingdom still endorsed these activities, but because these activities were what these people were, and what a person is does not stop being what it is, simply because the world that produced it has changed. And from above, from the world of rain and root and open sky, from somewhere outside the underground entirely, something fell. The nature of the abyss makes it difficult to seal completely. The void does not accept containment in the way ordinary matter accepts containment, because the void is precisely the absence of the properties that allow ordinary matter to be contained. The void-born children who had been sealed in the abyss when the Pale King closed the entrance above them had persisted in the dark. They were void. They did not require the things that ordinary living things require, did not decay in the way that ordinary living things decay, did not submit to the ordinary processes of ending that the ordinary world imposes on ordinary things. They persisted, and in persisting, they found eventually what persistent things always find: the edge of the thing that was containing them, the place where the seal was not quite complete, the way out that exists at the end of sufficient patience. One of them came up, or fell down, depending on how you measure direction, in a world where the distinction between up and down is a matter of where you are standing rather than a fixed property of space. It emerged from the abyss and entered the ruined kingdom above it. It was small and dark, and carried a nail, a simple weapon, a piece of pale ore worked into a point, sufficient for the kinds of encounters that the ruins of a kingdom host. It fell from somewhere into the forgotten crossroads and began to move. This was the night, the nameless, small, void-born night, who is the figure at the center of what happened next. It carried no memories that it could access in the usual way, or rather, the memories it carried presented themselves not as recollections, but as instincts, as the pull towards certain places, and the resistance toward others, as the feeling of recognition in spaces it had not consciously visited, as the particular weight of a history it could not articulate, but that expressed itself in the way it moved, and the choices it made, and the things it found, against all odds and all expectation, capable of. Hallownest received the night, the way ruins receive anything that arrives, without ceremony, without welcome, with the flat neutrality of a place that has ceased to have expectations. The first encounters were with the infected, with the creatures that had once been the kingdom's people, and now moved through the tunnels, with the amber glow of the Radiance's influence burning through them. The night fought them with the nail, and moved forward, and continued to move forward in the particular way that something continues to move forward, when the only alternative is staying where it is, and staying where it is not possible. The kingdom offered what it still had to offer. Merchants who had found ways to persist in the ruins. Iselda with her maps, Salubra with her charms. The various figures who had decided that the collapse of the civilization around them was not sufficient reason to stop doing the particular things they did. The grubs sealed in glass jars throughout the kingdom, waiting with the patience that creatures without the ability to do anything else develop by necessity, freed one by one when the night passed through and broke the glass. The nailsmith in his workshop, still working, still pursuing the perfection of the craft, with the intensity of someone for whom the work is not a means to an end, but the end itself. There was Hornet. She moved through the ruins with a precision and a purpose that the night could feel, even when it could not interpret it. She was neither ally nor enemy in any simple sense. She was something more specific, a figure with her own understanding of what was happening, and her own reasons for caring about it, whose actions toward the night expressed those reasons in a form that was not explanation, but evaluation. She fought the night, twice at junctures that mattered, not because she wanted to harm it, but because she needed to know what it was, whether it was capable of what the situation was going to require, whether it would hold under the kind of pressure that the situation was going to apply. The fight was a question. The night's survival was the answer. The Dreamgate gave the night access to the interior of the sleeping minds of Hallownest's significant dead, to the dreamers in their eternal sleep. their consciousness still occupied with the work of the seal, their minds defended by the accumulated weight of what they had felt when they chose to become what they were. The night moved through these dreamscapes with the void nature that was its most fundamental quality, met the dreamers in the spaces of their long sleep, and ended their connection to the seal, severed the thread that held the temple's lock in place, one dreamer at a time. Lurien dreaming was full of the quality of his life, the patient attention, the love that expressed itself through sustained observation, the particular loneliness of someone who has always preferred to watch the world at a slight remove, and who has sometimes wondered what it would feel like to be closer. His dream was populated by the watchers who had served him, still watching, still keeping the vigil in the interior of sleep. He was defeated in the dream the way dreams are defeated, not with a final physical blow, but with the dissolution that comes when the dreaming structure can no longer maintain itself against a force that is specifically constituted from the negation of structure. Monomon dreaming was full of the repository, the knowledge she had gathered and organized and preserved, the accumulated understanding of a civilization, the forms and the faces and the discoveries of a world that had learned to think. She had chosen the seal with understanding, had made the calculation that the choosing was worthwhile. In the dream, she offered the night what the living world had not, the information that the hollow night was not purely empty, that the plan had a flaw, that the time was coming when the flaw would become a fracture and the fracture would become a catastrophe. She was defeated and her dreaming dissolved, and the knowledge she had always been the keeper of dispersed back into the world that had originally generated it. Herrah dreaming was fierce and warm and specific, the particular intensity of a parent who has sacrificed everything for a child's future, the quality of love that has been maintained across years of separation and sleep, with the tenacity of something that cannot afford to weaken. Her dream was the deepest, and the deepest was her, and she was in her dream exactly what she had always been. A queen, a mother, a person of enormous and very specific power, defending something that was worth defending. She was defeated, and she dissolved, and the sacrifice she had made was completed in the ending of it. The purpose achieved, the toll accepted, the long sleep finally at rest. The seal broke. The 3 threads cut, the lock released. The temple of the black egg opened to the one thing that had earned the right to open it. The night entered. The hollow night was there. It had been there for the entire duration of the kingdom's decline, through every year of the infection's spreading, through every darkened lantern and every lost citizen and every mile of road that had become impassable, through the pale king's disappearance and Hallownest's slow unraveling. The hollow night had been standing in the temple, holding the ancient god inside itself. It had been maintaining the containment from the inside, being the container that kept the contents from returning to the world. It had been doing this with the faint, imperfect, half-present selfhood that the pale king had tried to eliminate and had not succeeded in eliminating. And the doing of it across that long stretch of time had changed it in ways that the pale king, when he chose it, could not have anticipated. It was not evil. It was not an enemy in any ordinary sense. What it was something that had been asked to be something it was not, and that had spent an impossible duration attempting to be that thing. And that was now, in the moment of the seal's breaking, simply what the long effort had made it, strained, damaged in the specific way that something is damaged when it has been held past its limit, for longer than its limit was designed for, fierce with the ferocity of something that has nothing but the role it has been playing, and that fights to preserve the role because the role is all there is. The night from the abyss defeated the hollow night. The vessel broke. The containment failed, and from the failing emerged the Radiance, ancient and vast and burning, with the accumulated grief and power of her long imprisonment. The light that had been compressed into a darkness for too long, finally free of the darkness, finally able to be what it was without the walls of the void holding it in. She was not kind in this emergence. She could not be kind. Kindness requires a kind of spaciousness, a quality of having enough that you can afford to be generous with what you have. The Radiance, in this moment, had nothing that was not rage and grief, and the specific texture of something that has been denied its fundamental nature for so long that it cannot remember what it felt like to simply be what it was before the denial. She emerged into the world with the full force of what she had accumulated, which was enormous. The Knight from the Abyss had been preparing for this, not consciously, not through planning, but through the accumulation of the journey itself, through every cavern traversed, and every creature fought, and every dreamer confronted in the space of sleep. It had gathered, across the full length of its journey through Hallownest, something more important than any specific tool or power. It had gathered the experience of having moved through this world and survived it, the deep cellular knowledge that comes from having been tested by a place and found sufficient to the testing. It had also, through the dream gate, entered spaces that the Radiance inhabited, had gone into the dream not just to reach the dreamers, but to face the manifestations of the ancient god's power in the territory she called her own, had encountered her in the space where she was strongest and had not been destroyed by the encounter. The void nature that was the Knight's fundamental quality had met the Radiance nature of the ancient god and had found something true, that negation is not weakness, that the dark, which is specifically the dark that corresponds to a particular light, is not merely the absence of that light, but is its counterpart, its complement, its equal in the particular equation of their relationship. The Knight from the Abyss pursued the Radiance into the deepest level of the dream, into the space that was her space, bright and ancient and saturated with a quality of light that had been accumulating since before the kingdom was built, a light that had turned inward and concentrated until brightness itself had become a kind of burning. She was there in her fullness, in the form that centuries of forgotten grief had given her, magnificent and terrible, a god who had been wronged and whose wrong was real, and whose power to respond to the wrong was also real, and who could not, in this moment, distinguish between the response to the wrong and the wrong itself. The fight that happened here was not ordinary. The void and the light met in the space of the dream, with the specific force of two ancient complementary natures finally occupying the same space, finally forced to reckon with each other without the structures and the seals and the careful management that had kept them separate. The Knight pressed the negation of its nature against the burning of the ancient gods, and the pressing was hard and was long and was the kind of exchange that does not have an obvious outcome when it begins. And from the abyss, from the sealed deep below the kingdom, from the darkness where the void-born siblings had been left, something rose. The siblings reached upward. The small, dark, self-ed beings who had been sealed in the abyss for having developed selves, who had been left in the darkness as failed experiments in the kingdom's survival, reached upward through whatever connection existed between them, and the Knight, who had also come from that darkness, and who was now at the final extremity of its engagement with the oldest light. They reached not because they had been asked, not because anyone had given them a reason to, but because connection persists even across sealing, because the void-born share something that the physical barrier of the sealed entrance cannot entirely sever, because one of them was in the greatest need it had ever been in, and the others felt the need, and they responded the way things respond, when the response is the nature of what they are. Their combined negation joined with the night's, the accumulated void of all the beings who had been made from it and sealed in it and left in it, rose through the dream and met the accumulated light of the ancient god who had been locked in a vessel and denied her nature for longer than the kingdom had existed. The meeting was conclusive, not immediate. Nothing of this scale is immediate, but conclusive. The patterns of the Radiance's consciousness, the specific configuration of light and awareness and accumulated grief that had made her a god, began to unravel. The burning that had been so intense it had become its own kind of darkness began to dissipate back into the general illumination of the world. She became not gone exactly. She became undone, unmade from the particular arrangement that had made her a person and a power, dispersed back into the fabric of existence from which, long before any kingdom or any king or any sealing, she had first assembled herself. The infection lost its source. The orange-gold glow that had been burning through the bodies and the minds of the citizens of Hallownest stopped receiving whatever it was that had been sustaining it. It did not end immediately. The processes it had initiated in individual bodies and in the landscape of the kingdom had their own momentum, their own biology, their own physical reality that did not simply cease when the source ceased, but it began to fade. The burning became less urgent. The creatures that had been the infected began, slowly, to exist in a different relationship to what they were, not cured, not restored to what they had been before the infection, because some things that happen to a body and a mind cannot be undone, only gradually moved past, but no longer actively consumed. The hollow night, freed of the impossible burden it had been carrying, dissolved into the dream, into the void, into whatever dissolution is available to something that was made from void and that has spent its existence being the container for the thing that was most opposite to void. The dissolution was not described in any record that survives, because there was no one there who could describe it. But the hollow night's absence from the temple of the Black Egg, after everything that happened there, carried in it the particular quality of something that has been released, not destroyed in the violent sense, not ended with force, but let go, finally, after having been held in an impossible position for far too long. What remained of Hallownest, after all of this, was a ruin. But it was a ruin with a different quality than the ruin it had been during the decades of the infection. It was a ruin that was no longer actively becoming more ruined. The infection was receding. The processes that had been consuming the kingdom from the inside were losing their urgency. The orange glow fading, the creatures that had carried it existing in a different register than they had existed in at the height of the infection's spread. The kingdom was damaged, it was diminished, but it had reached its bottom, and from the bottom, the only direction available is something other than further down. Hornet remained. She was perhaps the figure in Hallownest at the end of this who carried the most complete understanding of what had happened, connected by birth to 3 of the principal actors, tested by the kingdom's collapse and found sufficient to the testing, possessed of the clarity that her mother's sacrifice and her father's failure had, together, given her. She moved through the ruins with the same precision she had always moved with, attending to what needed to be attended to, assessing what needed to be assessed. The surviving merchants continued to sell what they had to sell, because commerce is a form of persistence that has its own logic, that does not require the world around it to make sense in order to continue. Salubra and her charms. The traveling merchant Sly, who had seen enough of the world to know that worlds capable of collapse are also capable of continuation. The nailsmith, who had finished what he came to finish, and who found, in the completion, both the satisfaction he had sought and the particular emptiness that satisfaction sometimes brings when there is nothing prepared to replace it. Quirrell sat at the blue lake. The lake was above the City of Tears, above the rain and the weight of the city's history, in a cavern where something of the light from the world above still filtered through in a way that made the water blue and still and cool. He sat there with the quality of someone who has arrived at the end of a long journey and is simply present in the ending for a while, not moving toward anything, not away from anything, simply at the lake in the particular peace that arrives when the urgency is gone and the exhaustion has not yet become ordinary life. He sat there, and then at some point he did not, and the lake continued to be the lake, and the light continued to come through. The White Lady remained in the Queen's gardens, rooted, alive in the way that very old things remain alive, not urgently, not with the engaged aliveness of a being in the middle of something, but with the deep, persistent aliveness of something whose roots go far enough down that surface conditions cannot reach the essential part of itself that continues. She had lost her husband and her children, and the kingdom she had been part of building, and she had lost them gradually, in the way that losses accumulate when the world changes slowly enough that each individual loss can be absorbed before the next one arrives, until the total is enormous, but the enormity is familiar. She continued, in the way that remaining things continue. She was there. The gardens were there. The light through the undergrowth was there. And that was something. The abyss remained at the bottom of the world. The void-born siblings who had not escaped, who had not participated in the dream confrontation, who were simply still there in the darkness where they had been left. They remained. The abyss does not change, because the kingdom above it changes. The abyss is older than the kingdom. It will be there when everything the Pale King built has completely faded from the stone of the world. The void persists as it has always persisted, as the deep note beneath everything that is made of light, the dark that gives the light its definition. The dream persists. The dreamers are gone. Their consciousness dissolved when the night severed their connection to the seal. Their long sleep finally ended. But the dream does not belong to the dreamers. The dream is the space that runs alongside the waking world, the interior of existence, the place where the significant things of Hallownest endure beyond the decay of their physical forms. The dead who felt enough linger there. The history of the kingdom lingers there. The shapes of things that mattered, the Pale King's throne, the temple's egg form, the city's perpetual weeping, persist in the dream with a quality that physical matter, which decays and crumbles and is colonized by other life, cannot maintain. The small dark night rests somewhere in the space of all of this. In the dream, perhaps, or in some form of continuation that the void nature makes available and that has no direct analogy in the experience of ordinary creatures. It has done what it fell into Hallownest to do, though not in the way the Pale King intended when he first conceived of vessels, not through the perfect emptiness he sought and could not achieve, but through the specific fullness that it turned out to be. It was void, and it was self, both at once, and the both at once was what the situation required. The void provided the negation. The self provided the will to use it. Neither alone was sufficient. Together, they were enough. The story of Hallownest is not a simple story. It does not resolve into a simple lesson about hubris or love or the danger of power or the danger of forgetting. It is a story of how things are complicated when the stakes are enormous and the actors are doing their best with what they have, and their best is not quite enough, and the insufficiency of their best has consequences they cannot fully foresee. The Pale King was not a villain. He was a being of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary power who loved his people and built them a world and chose, when the world was threatened, a solution that required him to do things that were not good in order to achieve something that was necessary. The Radiance was not a villain. She was an ancient being whose fundamental nature had been denied, whose existence had been ended not through death, but through the specific violence of universal forgetting, and who persisted because persistence is what very old things do, and who reached, eventually, for the minds that had been hers and caused enormous harm in the reaching. The Hollow Knight was not a villain. It was a sacrifice that had not consented to being a sacrifice, that had been asked to be something it was not, that had held on past the point where holding on was possible. And the void-born knight, the small dark thing that fell from the world above, it was not a hero in the traditional sense. It had no proclamation to make, no identity to assert, no speech at the end of the long journey. It was what it was, void and self, and the accumulated experience of having moved through this particular world at this particular time, and what it was turned out to be exactly what was needed, which is perhaps the closest thing to heroism that this kind of story has to offer. Not a hero who was made for greatness and rose to meet it. Something more modest and more true. A thing that existed, that moved, that encountered the world with what it had, and that found, in the having and the moving, that it was sufficient. Hallownest endures. Not as the Pale King designed it. Not as a monument to the proposition that the dark places of the world can be organized and illuminated and made into something as rich and complex and full of meaning as anything the surface world contains. That proposition was true, and its truth was proven, and the proof remains in the ruins of what was built on the basis of it, in the roads that are still roads, even though no one commissioned their maintenance, in the lanterns that still burn in the places where someone is still attending to them, in the maps that Cornifer drew so that those who came after would know where they were going. What endures is not the Pale King's vision, but the thing his vision produced. The people, the culture, the particular ways of being in the world that developed in the long years of the kingdom's prosperity, and that did not simply end when the kingdom ended. The mask maker's understanding of what a mask means. The nailsmith's devotion to craft as a form of self-expression. The watcher's belief that sustained attention is a form of love. Monomon's conviction that understanding a thing is the highest honor you can pay to it. These things persist not because the Pale King ordered their persistence, but because they were real, because they were genuinely valued by genuinely individual minds, because the gift of individuality, once given, generates a selfhood that does not simply stop when the giver is gone. The lanterns that are still burning in Hallownest are the lanterns that someone is still tending. And the tending is its own form of the gift, the small, daily, unglamorous work of keeping the light going in the dark, which is what the Pale King originally came to the deep world to do, which is what the kingdom was always really about, which is what continues even when the kingdom itself does not. The Pale King is gone. The Radiance is gone. The Hollow Knight is gone. The Dreamers are gone. What remains is everything they left behind. The world shaped by their presence and their absence. The world that was made by what they built and what they failed to build. By what they did and what they could not bring themselves to do. The world that is, in the end, the only record of what any of them were and what any of them meant. The void is still there at the bottom of the world. The dream is still there in the space between waking and sleeping. The roads of Hallownest are still there in the stone, running from where they started to where they end, carrying in their geometry the memory of a mind that thought very carefully about where a road should go and what a road should express about the world it moves through. And somewhere in the quiet of the kingdom, in the dream, perhaps, or in the particular continuity that void nature provides, which is different from the continuity available to ordinary things, the small dark night rests, having walked every road, having descended to the bottom of every depth, having met the oldest light with the deepest dark and found in the meeting that the dark was sufficient, that the void was not nothing, that the abyss, which had always been the bottom of everything, was also, under precisely the right circumstances, at exactly the right moment, a foundation. Rest now. You have walked the full length of Hallownest's story, from the worm form settling at the kingdom's edge, to the pale light filtering through new-carved caverns, to the first citizens discovering the extraordinary texture of their own inner lives, to the infection spreading its amber glow through tunnels that were meant to be full of lantern light, to the temple sealed and the dreamers sleeping, and the hollow night straining, to the final meeting of void and radiance in the space where the dream opens into whatever is beneath the dream. The world persists, the dark persists, and somewhere in the dark, at the bottom of the deepest place, something continues, patient, quiet, full of the journey it has taken, a witness to everything that Hallownest was, and everything it became, and everything it might yet, in the long future of its ruins, become again. The lanterns still burn, the rain still falls on the city of tears, the road runs on, and the story, having been told from beginning to end, settles into the particular silence that stories settle into when they are complete. Not gone, not forgotten, but resting, the way all things rest when the telling is done and the listening can finally, gently let go.